welcome everyone to our 4RG Meets this evening. And it's such a beautiful evening, so I'm glad we've got people that have been willing to give that up to come and listen. I know there's a lot of people interested in our topic tonight, and so we look forward to hearing your comments and hearing this presentation that we're doing today.
So yes, we'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the ancestral lands and waters of the Anishinaabe Mississauga people, lands covered by the Williams Treaty and Treaty 20. We respectfully acknowledge those who have walked on the earth before us, those who walk on it now, and future generations who have yet to walk upon it. May we gain strength and wisdom so that all may continue to treat the land, water, and all living beings with honor and respect. And may we not forget that we are all treaty people and have obligations under those treaties.
So concern over climate change and energy security have, of course, been growing steadily over the past few years, and in fact, even over the past decades. And even though that the government's solar microfit program is no longer available, the demand for solar has continued to grow, although I'm learning it's a solarscape is the term.
Solar coaster.
Solar coaster,
Yeah.
that's it. Solar coaster. And so anyways, tonight's speaker will summarize the opportunities and costs of residential clean energy and technology and how you can get started your own clean energy project. So Jean-Pierre Pawliw.
Jean-Pierre.
How come it's Jean-Pierre, you're
Sorry.
right. JP, we'll just go with JP.
You can't mistake it with that.
JP Pawliw is a co-owner and vice president of General Solar Renewable Energy Systems Incorporated. Is a professional engineer and a licensed journeyman electrician. JP brings a broad set of skills and experience to the clean energy table and has co-led Generation Solar to be a highly respected and clean energy contractor, able to handle a wide array of projects with a focus on quality and customer experience. Generation Solar has been serving Peterborough and area for 24 years. So please join me in welcoming JP as our featured speaker this evening. And JP, make sure you unmute yourself and take it away.
Super, thanks very much. Yeah, happy to be here. I couldn't have introduced myself better myself. So I have a presentation that is targeted at individual homeowners to give an introduction to what is the opportunity, how do we get into solar if that interests us. So just give me a moment here and I'll see if I can share my screen. Okay, thanks very much for the warm welcome, I appreciate it. So let's just get into this. So this is a slide actually that Al Slavin brought to my attention in a great article he had in the Peterborough Examiner a number of months ago, which is the growth of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada over time. And it's broken down by industry sector. So in the middle there, I've highlighted electricity, buildings, and transport, which make up over a third of the total emissions that we have in Canada. And that is the portion of emissions that we as individual homeowners can affect directly. The other ones, waste, agriculture, heavy industry, oil and gas, we can affect those indirectly, but not directly. So I'm not really going to talk about transportation or buildings. I'm really talking about electricity, which is a small slice of the overall pie, but I'll reiterate something I said earlier, which is I think clean energy is something that anybody can do for any number of reasons. It's all part of the solution. And I think that what's most important is that each of us takes the opportunities that we have and the resources that we have and applies it to things to climate change solutions that appeal to us. And for some of us, it's riding a bike. For some of us, it's hanging our laundry on a laundry line instead of using the dryer. For some people, it's buying an EV. And for some people, it's putting up a solar energy system. And so I think that it's all part of the solution and it affects that overall third of emissions, although strictly speaking in Ontario, the direct emissions reductions for clean energy is relatively low when it comes to electricity. That's going to change if the province builds a whole bunch of gas plants as they propose to do to make up for coming shortfalls in generation in the coming years. So what clean energy are we talking about here? There's solar energy, which most people are accustomed to and think of right away. And it's really what we do. So that's the focus of my expertise and what I'm going to talk about tonight. But it includes things like wind energy. It includes load management. So that's what the light bulb indicates. So we can reduce our consumption and therefore reduce our emissions. Hydropower, the water droplet, and energy storage helps smooth out irregular energy sources like solar and wind. This is a confusing slide, but not really. On the left-hand side, you'll see the traditional energy infrastructure. At the top of the slide on the upper left, you'll see large-scale generation. So there's nuclear power plants, there's wind turbines, there's solar panels in this particular graphic, but that could include other kinds of thermal plants, natural gas plants, coal plants, large hydro, all generated on a large scale. They go through some sort of transmission system. Can you see my mouse move around on the slide there? Yep, no, that's okay. Transmission system, which goes to a distribution network. It sends energy to industry and commercial establishments, and then eventually to consumers. That's a very unidirectional energy flow. And this is going to change going forward, and clean energy enables that change to what's considered a distributed energy infrastructure. So you'll see the same things are all here. There's the same thermal plants, the same solar panels, the same wind turbines, the same houses, the same factories, but they're interconnected in a whole bunch of different ways. And the details aren't really important. What's important is that this shift from a centralized unidirectional energy infrastructure to a decentralized distributed style. And the reason this is important is that clean energy infrastructure is super well suited to that. So when we talk about putting solar panels on everyone's roof, on different buildings, then that is enabling distributed energy resources, distributed energy infrastructure. One nice thing about clean energy is it's very scalable. We can install a small number of solar panels or a very large number, and the technical differences are relatively minor between them. Wind turbines are the same, although they don't really suit themselves to urban environments. Clean energy infrastructure, and solar in particular, is extremely fast to deploy. In fact, it's the fastest energy infrastructure of all generation technologies that can be deployed, meaning we can get more watts built faster than any other technology. And we have a good available resource here. I mean, people think of a northern latitude as not necessarily being conducive to solar energy, but we actually have a adequate solar resource to make a significant amount of energy in this area. Last thing about distributed energy resources, and I'll touch on this later on, is they fit right in with something called a smart grid. And you may or may not have seen that. A smart grid is when you basically take energy and the internet and smush them together. And now you've got all these distributed energy resources spread out all over the place, talking to each other, and operating together to achieve an overall stable grid and an adequate energy supply for everybody. So what are the benefits of clean energy? Well, I've been talking a lot about climate action. That's a very important benefit. Another benefit is reduced energy bills. The cost of energy is a big factor. Cost of living is a big factor these days. Lots of people are concerned about it. Energy is a part of that, and clean energy can be used to stabilize and reduce monthly or yearly energy costs. Stability is actually, in my opinion, a more important benefit than actually reducing them, because if we're able to stabilize energy costs, we take uncertainty out of the question. So for people who have constrained resources, whether it's an individual or a household or even a small business, especially a small business for whom energy costs are a large part of their cost base, if we can provide some stability to those costs, some foreseeable either no escalation or a very low escalation, and people can be confident that their energy costs are not going to suddenly jump up, then that's a huge benefit. And I think also on the business side of things, people like clean energy and it attracts customers. This slide obviously was made for a business presentation, but I think it's true also on a personal level, because one of the things that we do as leaders, whether it be clean energy leaders or other leaders, is we model the behavior we'd like to see in others. And if we're modeling adoption of clean energy, that means people we know, our friends, our family, other stakeholders will look at what we're doing in a positive light. And I think that's it's a very easy thing to do because clean energy is so scalable and accessible. Okay. The three things that I sort of wanted to talk about, really about two. In the context of a clean energy system, there's the generation of energy, which is conversion of sunlight into electricity. There may or may not be storage of energy. I'll get on that in a moment. And then this notion of net metering. Net metering is the program, for lack of a better explanation, through which we can connect solar energy assets to the grid. Bear with me for a sec here. Okay, so if we're generating energy, we want to use that energy somehow. Net metering is the structure, the administrative bureaucratic structure that allows us to do that really easily. We generate the energy with solar panels on our roof. That energy is pushed into our homes and we use it. We use it for our computers, for our TVs, for our washing machines, for whatever it is. The appliances don't know where the energy comes from and they don't care. It's all the same electrons to them. But we want to make sure that we're using as much of that energy as possible. And so when the sun is shining and our system is generating all this energy, maybe we don't need it all. That's okay. That's what net metering is for. That energy will go backwards through your utility meter and end up as a credit on the bill. Now, there's a whole bunch of complexity around that. And we can talk about that later. I don't intend to get into it with any depth. But the point is that every kilowatt hour of clean energy that your system generates is counted. It's either counted because you use it, and that's a kilowatt hour of energy you don't consume from the grid, or it ends up as a credit on your bill to be applied against that month's consumption or future month's consumption. And you can carry credits on your utility bill for up to 12 months. Storage, people talk a lot about batteries. Batteries are a big topic these days. Some major announcements recently in Ontario regarding mining of cobalt and lithium and these kinds of things. Storage in the context of home energy is really most applicable for backup power applications. Yes, it is true we can do other things. For example, peak shaving, where if electricity is extremely expensive for a moment, you can be charging or discharging your battery strategically to reduce your consumption when electricity is most expensive. That's one example of a number of things that are technically possible, but for a bunch of financial reasons and practical reasons, it's not a high priority. I don't think it should be a high priority for anyone in the current climate, but backup power does make sense. So for people who are concerned about losing electricity due to a large storm or other major events, and there's legitimate concern about the stability and resiliency of the grid these days, battery-based backup power is a viable alternative to a generator or other form of backup power, or none at all. Okay, how does net metering work? So my little graphic here, on the left-hand side, over here on the left-hand side, you've got the grid, your meter, your main electricity panel in your home. On the far right, you've got a washing machine, your loads, your lights, your TVs, whatever, and then the solar panel down here. And the arrows indicate energy flow. So the green arrow indicates grid energy. So you'll see, or sorry, the blue arrow indicates grid energy. So here's grid energy flowing this way to the meter, to the distribution panel, and from here, it goes to your loads. This is what Everybody has who does not have solar, it works the same way. Energy flows in this direction. When you add a net metered solar energy system, we're injecting this wonderful orange energy, and it's going basically into this panel. And this panel is a big mixing pot. And you'll see here, this arrow is blue and orange. So basically the energy that's going from the panel to the appliances is a mixture of grid energy or solar energy, depending on the time of day and what's going on. If it's nighttime, then there's obviously no solar. If it's the middle of the day and it's a shiny day, sunshiny day, then this would be all orange. If no solar energy is needed by the appliances at any given moment, it goes backwards through the meter and to the grid to be used by your neighbors. This is beneficial to the utility because for every kilowatt hour that you push to the grid, it's a kilowatt hour that's going to your neighbors that the utility does not need to supply all the way from the generation station. If we add batteries into the mix, it gets a little bit more complicated. So the main picture here, you would recognize you've got blue energy coming from the grid to the meter, to the distribution panel, and to the loads. When we've got batteries for backup power, we add another distribution panel. And so you'll see the blue energy comes from this panel to this panel, and then goes to these loads. In the meantime, the solar energy comes from the sun to the solar panels, through the battery system to this distribution panel, where it can go to this loads, up to these loads, or again, back to the utility. Functionally, it works exactly the same as the prior picture. Now, if my thing little works here, there we go. So the grid goes away. Let's say there's a storm. Let's say there's a Derico that comes through and knocks all the trees down. And the grid goes away. Well, the main panel that was here does not have power. But this panel down here does have power. It gets from the solar and battery system, and it's now providing 100% solar energy to these loads that are connected to this panel. When the grid comes back, the system goes back to normal. So who can do net metering? Anybody who owns a utility account. In practical terms, you need to own the facility as well. So for example, if you are oh wait, that's not actually true. As long as you own the utility account and you could have access to install the system on the building, then you can do net metering. So a homeowner, a business owner, a condo board is an example where they could do the common areas. A landlord, common areas, or if the landlord is providing electricity to tenants, that would make sense. Where it doesn't make sense is where there is no load that that the utility owner has. Because with net metering, we're trying to displace load. For every kilowatt hour that you consume, we're trying to displace that with clean energy. I mentioned earlier that the credits carry over for up to 12 months. After 12 months, they go away. So imagine a storage unit. There are lots of storage units around the outside of town. They're just giant lockers, fields and fields of lockers. Every locker has a light in it, so there is some load, but that is very little load. The ratio of roof space to load is very, very high. So we could put a large solar energy system on these storage facilities, but there's not enough energy usage, not enough load to take advantage of all that generation. And so that makes it not a good match. I'll talk more about the matching on a later slide. This thing at the bottom of the slide, third-party ownership, is a policy mechanism to allow someone else to own the solar energy system on your building. It enables creative relationships like leasing of equipment or leasing of rooftops and PPAs, which are power purchase agreements. These are more complicated structures that aren't really relevant for individual homeowners. They're more relevant for businesses. A large organization or even a utility could own and operate a solar energy system on the roof of a business, meter that solar energy, and then sell the solar energy to the occupant of the business, whether it be the owner of the business or the owner of the building or a tenant. But it's a much more complicated relationship. It's common in the States, but it's not very common here. But this policy enabler of third-party ownership will create the opportunity for those relationships to become more common. Okay, the money slide. So what does it cost? So it can vary quite a bit, but I think from a budgetary perspective, if you're wondering how much does it cost to get into this on the residential scale, you should be counting on something in the range of $20,000 to $40,000 for residential rooftop solar installation that is net metering with no batteries. That's for a roof-mounted system. If you want to have a ground-mounted system, ground mounting is a great idea for certain applications, but there's a lot more nuts and bolts, a lot more hardware involved, foundations, trenching, that sort of thing. And so it does add cost. It's going to add $10,000 or $15,000 to your total system cost. And then adding lithium battery storage is going to add another $20,000 to $50,000 on the total system cost. I mentioned lithium batteries because that's really what everyone's interested in these days. Older technologies of lead acid, they still function, but honestly, people don't want them. They're just not in fashion. There is some ongoing cost that you should be aware of. You'll need to tell your insurance company about these systems. They're going to want to know what it's worth and if you want it to be insured. And then there is a preventative maintenance cost. Like anything, there can be problems that crop up over time, and periodic preventative maintenance inspection is a valuable thing to mitigate the risk of anything that becomes before it becomes a major problem. An example might be some systems that were installed in the past did not have any protection from birds or rodents getting underneath the solar array. Sometimes it's an issue, sometimes it's not. A preventative maintenance inspection can spot these things before they become problems. There is debt available for buying clean energy systems. Banks generally get it now, but more importantly right now is there is $40,000 of free money, not free money, but an interest-free loan available from the federal Canada Greening Homes program. I think clean energy is an interesting opportunity for nonprofits and charities, some of whom own their own facilities, because it creates a lever for fundraising, and it creates stability for ongoing operating costs. If you have a business, there's some favorable tax implications, which I won't go into. And then from a homeowner's perspective, it does not have an impact on your property tax. And that's actually enshrined in legislation, that a clean energy addition to your home cannot make your property taxes go up, even if it makes your property value go up. Okay, the next money slide. And this is the one that's a bit more complicated. I'm asked this question a lot. What's the payback on a solar power system? It's a difficult question to answer, and the reason is every unit of electricity that your system generates has a value, and that value is equal to the price of electricity you're not paying from the grid. Remember, in a net metered system, you're displacing energy from the grid. Instead of buying it from the utility, you're making it yourself. So the value of the energy that you're making is equal to the value of the electricity you're not buying from the utility, which is straightforward, except that the electricity you're not buying from the utility changes in price. The price you pay today is not going to be the price you pay next year or 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And so the payback which is basically a calculation of if I buy this thing today, how long will it take me to make that much money back in savings? The payback depends entirely on what happens to the price of electricity. So when you do those financial calculations, you have to plug in a number. What happens to the price of electricity? If you assume it's going to rise a lot, then your payback is really good. If you assume it's not going to rise at all, then your payback is much less, is much lower. So we try not to use payback as a measure of economics for these systems. If forced, I will say that if we assume escalation of electricity at around 3 or 4% per year, the payback for a residential scale system is in the range of 15 or 20 years. A more interesting calculation is something we call levelized cost of energy, LCOE, which in its simplest form is the total lifetime cost in dollars divided by the total lifetime benefit in kilowatt hours. And that gives you a direct comparison on price of electricity. So if you'll see, we've got dollars on the top, kilowatt hours on the bottom, which would give us a dollars or a cents per kilowatt hour cost. And what I can say is that right now, you can generate your own electricity using solar energy at a residential scale for about the same price that you can buy it from the utility for. I think that's an important realization, that you can generate it yourself for the same price for which that you can, as compared to buying it from the utility. All you're doing is buying it all in advance. You're basically buying 20, 25, 30 years worth of electricity in advance by investing in this technology, in this equipment. The net benefit does depend on tax if you're a business, and there are some very favorable tax opportunities in that regard. Everything I've been talking about to date is really just talking about generation. It's the generation of energy that has an economic case to be made, whether we talk about payback or levelized cost of energy or any other financial calculation. It's the generation that has a financial benefit. Backup batteries do not. There's no direct payback for backup batteries. Possible exception is if you have some valuable process, if you're a business, for example, and you can't afford to be down, then batteries have a very clear financial incentive. But on a residential scale, storage batteries are a purely subjective investment. They're a purely quality of life decision. There is no financial case to be made for battery backup. So if you want to proceed with a solar power project for your home, what does it mean? What does it look like? What does a project look like? So this is just a very quick flow chart on how do we proceed with a clean energy project for your home. So my first step is going to be a discovery call. We're going to talk about on the phone, what are your objectives? How do we get there? I'll give you a preliminary estimate. And then if that looks good to you, then I'll have a site assessment. At the site assessment, I'll look at your roof, I'll look at your electrical connection, we'll figure out the details, and then I can give you a firm quote. If you like the quote, we'll sign a contract and collect a deposit. This is all part of the sales process. Then we move into the construction process. The first thing is there's a design phase. We get permits. There's a Hydro 1 permit, building permit, electrical safety authority. Then we do construction, commissioning, inspections, and closeout. So once we've signed a contract, it takes 5 to 8 weeks to implement the project, plus any lineup in our queue and any issues of material availability. I did mention the Canada Greener Homes Initiative. There is a $5,000 grant available for homeowners and an up to $40,000 interest-free loan. There is a link there, and I have sent this presentation to Scott, and he can distribute it, so you don't need to write this down. There's a link to apply for the program. You can also connect with Peterborough Greenup. They can help you out with the program, and there are a number of other providers as well. There is an audit process You have to have a home energy audit completed by a qualified auditor. Once you get the audit results, you can implement your solar project. There's a second audit, and then you get your money. I'm not familiar with the details of the loan, but I do have clients that are taking advantage of it. So looking forward in clean energy, there are a couple things that are quite interesting. Right now, EVs are really driving change, because electric vehicles are creating enormous charging loads on the grid, and the utilities are scared. And the utilities and the Ontario Energy Board and the IESO, which keeps all the lights on in the province, are actively working to develop solutions to the fact that they're expecting electricity consumption to go up dramatically with the adoption of EVs. And part of that EV innovation is the notion of vehicle to grid. So if you've got an electric vehicle, it's got a great big battery in it. Why can't we use that battery for backup power? Why can't we use that to contribute to grid stability? I think this is going to be the next piece of innovation that drives clean energy in the province, because the administrative and bureaucratic infrastructure that allows for vehicle to grid bidirectional energy flow will force a major step up in distributed energy resource management across the board. And EVs just happen to be the next thing coming down the pipe. After that is something called virtual net metering. Virtual net metering is actually really cool in that it'll decouples the clean energy system from the building. So right now, if you want to do this, you do it on your own home, your own business. It applies to your own account. But let's say your house is full of shade. Let's say you've got a really complicated roof with no good place to put solar panels, but you really want to do it. How do you do that? Well, maybe you join a group and you all get together and collectively you own a net metered system on the factory on the corner, on the roof of the factory on the corner, or the warehouse. And then the benefit that comes from that, you all share together across your own utility accounts. Virtual net metering is a piece of policy that enables you to do that. Another example is if you're a business owner and you own two facilities, maybe you own an office over here and a factory over there. And then maybe the factory is very compact but consumes a lot of electricity. The office is very large but doesn't consume very much electricity, but has a big roof. With virtual net metering, you could put the solar resource on the roof of the office, but then apply the benefit to the factory. Another example is if you've got a house and a cottage, you could have the solar resource on one of those buildings, but get the benefit applied to both utility accounts. So virtual net metering is a policy initiative that, in my opinion, must be created at some point to support distributed energy resources. And I think it's going to be an extremely important piece of policy. The prior government was beginning pilot projects with virtual net metering, and then the current government came in and stopped them all. And so then back to this thing called a smart grid. You know, when you've got virtual net metering, vehicle to grid, you've got the internet connected there. You can have peer-to-peer energy transactions. This is really, really exciting stuff for me when you're trading energy, you know, across the street to your neighbor or across town or across the province. I think that's going to be really cool, but we're still quite a ways off from that. So that's it for me. I do see some questions in the chat. How about I just go straight to those?
Just before you do,
Yep.
I want to thank you very much for what you've said so far, and we'll definitely get to those questions. I'm really impressed with how you took what a lot of people find is a very complicated situation and system and have really made it quite simple to understand in terms of how that electricity flows and the net metering. And I really appreciate the kind of the new thinking, the new initiatives that you're talking about, because these are the questions that come up. Well, it'll never work because blah, blah, blah. And you're telling us about some ways of getting around those problems with the virtual net metering and the smart metering and the peer-to-peer transactions and that whole vehicle to grid supply. I mean, those are ways of solving some of the roadblocks that people will throw up as an argument against solar energy. So it's awesome to hear that. And thank you very much for your presentation. And yeah, do you want to read those comments yourself, or do you want me to read them out and you answer them, or how would you?
I'll just read it if that's all right.
Okay, that's perfect.
Okay, can you take advantage of that property tax exception? Juice the extra value to your property. I don't understand that, Steve.
Oh, I just meant you said that you couldn't be penalized for having an extra property value due to solar. So could you somehow over-represent the extra value to your property? Like, who assesses that?
Oh, well, that would be out of your control, because MPAC does your property assessment.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know how they discount the solar that's on it. So I can't answer that question. Next question, prices of solar panels are plummeting, but is the total gross cost of installation and everything, of which the panels are only a small factor, declining too? At the moment, the answer is no. Other costs are rising, anything to do with metal of any type. So solar, electric panels, cable, mounting aluminum, all that stuff is rising. And so I would say system costs have been flat or rising for about 3 years now. Marilyn Freeman asks, who is responsible for getting the various permits? If you hire us, we do it all. Stephen Morton, is there a good rule of thumb for required roof area, south-facing roof area, below which solar isn't worth it? Or should people always just book an assessment? Worth it is subjective. I can't answer that. I can say that a maximal residential scale system needs about 1,000 square feet of roof. More than that, we can't really take advantage of. I would say if you are, I mean, an installation has fixed costs. And so a very small installation has a very high proportion of its cost represented by fixed costs, which means it's, relatively speaking, very expensive. But it still may be worth it for you. So I think that unless you actually get an assessment, and we can do assessments on a lot of houses remotely, we can use Google Earth imagery. We have some really fantastic modeling tools, and we can get you to a budgetary value very quickly, assuming we've got some decent Google Earth imagery. So I think if you're on the small side, you should probably check with somebody. Why virtual net metering as opposed to just letting anybody sell any energy back into the grid? That's a very complicated question. There is no marketplace, I think, is the best answer. There's no one who's going to buy your energy. Net metering is a very specific relationship where you get value for your produced energy. Virtual net metering basically is the marketplace that's being proposed to allow people like you and me to get more, to take the value in our generated energy and share it with other people one way or another. There simply is no mechanism for that right now. And if I'm not correctly answering your questions, please unmute yourself and chime in or stick up your hand or something. Patrick McCauley asks, is there a technical reason why the amount of electricity you generate is limited to the load of your home, or is net metering just a policy that has been adopted to impose this limitation? The whole idea of net metering is that you offset your consumption. So generating 110% or 120% or 200% of what you consume on an annual basis has no role to play in the notion of net metering. Keep in mind that net metering allows the time scale to not matter. You could generate all your energy in the summertime and use it all in the wintertime. That's okay. Net metering takes care of that. But if over the course of a whole year, you're carrying credits, net metering as a piece of provincial legislation was not contemplated to deal with that. Virtual net metering would allow you to take advantage of excess generation. So if you have the capacity to generate 50% more energy than you need on your roof, then you could take that extra 50% and allocate it to your cottage. You could allocate it to your kids. You could in some way connect it to someone else's utility account and therefore take advantage of that excess generation. What is the current queue? I guess that's our construction queue. We're currently booking into winter constructions. So we are full until the end of this year with a few projects going into next year. So winter, spring for us. Fiona asks, we received an estimate for panels on a flat roof and found them much more expensive than this on an angled roof. Has or can this change? Mounting on a flat roof is more complicated and is more expensive, period. So no, it has not changed and it's not likely to change. And if anything, the delta is getting larger because the difference between flat roof mounting and sloped roof mounting is hardware, and hardware costs are going up. That's all the questions in the chat.
Well, I have a couple more questions. We currently have solar panels on our roof. They were done under the microfit program, but we didn't buy them. They are owned by a third party. And so I have two questions related to that. One is, if we were to buy them back on a what do you call that? When you've already been renting for a while on a
prorated basis?
Yeah, that's the one, the prorated basis. Is the microfit program transferable? In other words, would I then benefit from that microfit program that was started with the third party?
So the third party holds the contract.
Yes.
The contract had a start date and an end date and has terms.
Yes.
If you were to buy out your contract with the third party, you would then own the balance of the contract. So the microfit contract terms would be unchanged. You would now be the owner of it, and you're buying it from the current owner.
Right. Okay.
And so that would be no different administratively, really, than if you owned the microfit system and you were selling your house to somebody else. The buyer of your house there'd be a process for transferring ownership of the microfit contract from you to the buyer of your house. In your case, you have the additional step of buying out the system from the system owner.
Right.
And then they should help you transfer the contract to your name.
Okay, that's what I understood. So I just wanted to check that. My second question related to that is, for anybody that is on a microfit program, and so they're getting money back from Hydro One, when that microfit program ends, whatever the term of that contract is, what's the general approach then? Because it would then benefit you to net metering, so then hire someone like you to come in and change over to a net metering system.
That's the big question. What happens at the end of the microfit program? The short answer is thousands of people in Ontario are going to say, now what? And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that an awful lot of people have microfit contracts. And so the utilities, the OEB, the ISO, and the government are going to have to find a solution that works and that treats people fairly. In my opinion, virtual net metering is the obvious answer. With virtual net metering, it no longer matters where the generation is. And so it's simply an administrative change that you're taking the benefit being generated from your microfit system and applying it, that's on an account over here, and applying it to an account over here. That's so much smarter than converting your system to a net metered system. Then we have to go out to your site, take the wires out of here, move them over here, put them in here, a whole bunch of permits and approvals, and none of that needs to happen if we have virtual net metering. Keep in mind that for you as a homeowner, it's relatively straightforward because you have a load account at the same place. So you can conceptually think about converting it to a net metered system. But there are thousands of systems out there with no load. It's a system out in a field. It's a system on a warehouse where there's no load. Like, there's no net metering option for those systems. There has to be something above and beyond net metering, and virtual net metering would solve the problem.
Yeah, that really would make a lot simpler for sure. That's really good. I think you have some more questions on the
Yes, I do.
chat there.
Starting with, I believe.
Is it viable to disconnect from the grid and have a battery to be your own source of energy, your own sole source of energy? It is certainly possible. So if that's what you mean by viable, then the answer is yes. And it's expensive. If you know your average consumption in kilowatt hours per day, take that number, multiply it by anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000, and that's going to be a budget for being off grid on that level of consumption. So if your average consumption is 20 kilowatt hours per day, you should expect to spend $120,000, $150,000 to take that off grid. So is that viable? That's up to you. Can individuals take this on as a DIY project? Can they? Yes, they can. It is covered by building permits. It is covered by the electrical code. And so whereas 15, 20 years ago, because we've been doing this for a long time, 15, 20 years ago, solar was seen as a DIY industry. People got their stuff together and they put systems together, and it just happened. But that was before the electrical code even recognized this as its own thing. Regulation has caught up. In fact, it's caught up to the point where it's sort of holding the technology back. And so there's a lot to know, there's a lot to get right. And so in my opinion, you have to be pretty skilled and technically competent to undertake a project successfully on your own. People do it. We get referrals from the electrical inspector because people do it badly. So I think that yes, it is possible. It also depends on scale. You know, if you're just tinkering in your backyard with 1 or 2 solar panels, that's easy to do. But if you're talking about more of a full-blown residential scale installation, I would really recommend you hire a qualified contractor. Of course, I'm biased. Is there any new exciting PV panel technologies on the horizon? I actually don't care. If I can't buy it, I don't pay attention to it. The answer is yes, there's all kinds of exciting technologies in the lab, and they've been there for years, and they're going to be there for years until I can buy it. I really don't care about it. Every year, there is incremental improvements in technology, but they're not necessarily new or exciting. They're just incremental. Regarding PV panel technologies, there's a really good recent Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Yeah, that guy makes some good stuff that discusses this. So Steve has put a link in the chat to an article about PV technologies. Like I said, there's really cool stuff out there, but I don't have time to wade into it. Patrick asks, why is disconnecting from the grid so much more expensive than using net metering? Isn't the installation cost the same plus a battery? The answer, Patrick, is if you're net metered, you're in parallel with the grid. On any given day, if the solar doesn't generate enough energy for your loads, we don't care because the grid is there to make up all the slack. If you disconnect the grid, the system is responsible for 100% of your energy. And so we need to scale it up a lot to make sure that it's reliable on crummy days when there's no sun. And that results in the system being much larger. And if you need more detail than that, we should probably talk offline.
But isn't that why you have a battery to take account of those situations?
Yes. There are a number of design considerations to do with how much energy do you capture, how much do you store, because we need to make sure that there's more energy coming in and being stored than is going out every day, not just the good days. And so when we look at the bad days, when we design for the bad days, the total system ends up being much larger. And we can't just increase the battery size or it just increase the solar size because the system needs to be in balance. There's a lot of well, design constraints that in terms of making sure the whole system is working well. And people who live off the grid also tend to have a fossil fuel generator, either a manually operated one or an automatically operated one, because even when we design for the doldrums of November, December, there are still periods of time when there's not enough sun and they rely on their generator.
I was wondering, if we go to the virtual net metering and you're not necessarily hooked up on your side of the meter, then with your kind of forward thinking and new initiatives, is there ways that when you know you have this would be at the power company level, are there ways of kind of knowing how much electricity production there is in a neighborhood, and if they're not, say, damaged by a storm and would work as a microgrid and cut off from the main damaged grid? Is that kind of technology possible? Or is anybody thinking about it?
Possible, absolutely, and existing and operating in different places in the world. It's called a microgrid, and it is still considered experimental. And there are some places that are doing various kinds of pilot projects in Canada. A lot of the development is happening in the north. Northern communities that rely on 100% on diesel generators are installing solar arrays and wind turbines to work in conjunction with the diesel generators and forming their own microgrids. Microgrids in an urban area are much more difficult to experiment with because the grid exists. And so you can't just kind of hive a piece of it off and say, we're going to have an experiment over here. Also, existing utilities and communities are risk averse and change averse. And so it's difficult to get these things pushed through. I did mention that virtual net metering is a policy. There were pilot projects being started back in 2017 that were canceled as soon as the current government came in. But the current government is starting pilot projects on something they call community energy. When you look at it, it's virtual net metering, but they won't use the word. I don't know why. So this stuff is beginning to take shape. And I was just on a call recently regarding updates to the distribution system code. So that's the province-wide set of rules for electricity distribution and generation. And the commentary from the fellow who's on one of the committees there is that, 15 years ago, the utilities, the OEB, the IESO did not want to deal with this solar stuff. It's too complicated, it's too small, it's too difficult. And he said that there's been a sea change and that utilities now recognize this as the way it's going to happen. And that we're turning a huge ship. It's going to take a long time to turn the ship. But most importantly, the people in decision-making authority positions are on board with the concept of distributed energy resources. That includes microgrids, it includes vehicle to grid, it includes virtual net metering, all this stuff. They're conceptually on board. And so that's a huge bit of good news as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that would be awesome, because I mean, when that derecho came through, this particular little subdivision that we're in was down for 5 days. And there are at least 2, if not 3 rooftop solar panels in the subdivision. And it's kind of like, wow, all these people are without electricity and they're not able to charge their phones, and there's electricity right here.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we have in our office here, we've got a solar array on the roof. We've got a battery backup system over here. And in that storm, we were an island of electricity. And so we were operating fully functional, electricity, lights, internet, phone, everything. The only place within like a 3-block radius, and we put a table out front. We ran extension cords out there. People could come charge their laptops and stuff. And yeah, there's no reason why this can't be expanded upon. But there are a lot of technical things to get right. And most importantly, there's no political will to do this right now. A couple more questions in the chat. Can you tell us something about the size, look, and regulations for backup batteries? So for a residential application, backup batteries would be, well, the smallest implementation would probably, it's about like 30 inches wide by 4 feet tall by 8 inches off the wall. That's for probably the smallest implementation. The largest practical implementation is going to be about the size of a refrigerator. The lithium batteries are going to be installed in some kind of enclosure or come as a prepackaged industrially designed system. So it's not going to be like a batteries with wires hanging out everywhere. It's going to be a very clean installation. And if you reach out to me later, I can send you some photos of some of our installations. The one thing about batteries right now is the most recent electrical code that came out in May of this year was highly, highly restrictive on installation of batteries in homes. And it's a case of the pendulum swinging too far. There were risks identified, and the regulatory regime swung to be highly restrictive and is in the process of swinging back. And it's as crazy as it is to say, I mean, it's October, it's 5 months since the code was released. We are still in a gray zone where we're still trying to figure out the correct interpretation of these code rules as it relates to individual projects. And so it's a state of flux, and there's no clear answer to that question. Next question. We are served by Alert and have heard that the choice is either entirely on net metering or going off the grid. Is this correct? Yeah, so Electra is just a utility.
Yeah.
The choice is either entirely on net metering or going off the grid. I'm not really sure what the problem is there because net metering is highly flexible. I would not consider, I'm not aware of another option that I would recommend. Or are you saying that batteries are not allowed?
I guess I'm saying that backup batteries might not be allowed.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Okay.
Jean-Pierre, how long does a battery last?
Yeah,
Like
great
if-
question. Great question. So battery lifespan depends on a number of factors, one of which is how frequently it's cycled. So if it sits there fully charged most of the time and then is discharged during an outage and then brought back up, that will last a lot longer than a battery that is cycled every day. That said, different batteries are designed to do different things. So you want a question in years, you should expect a lead-based backup battery to last 10 years. A lithium-based backup battery should be 25 or 30 years or possibly longer. We don't have enough history of that technology to really know what its total lifespan is going to be.
Well, we have exceeded our 8 o'clock finish time, and it's certainly, if there are more questions, I would keep asking them, but people are getting away to other things. Our numbers in our group have dropped down, but I just want to thank you once again for coming out and talking to us tonight. I've learned a ton of information. I think I will be applying some of that myself, and I'm sure lots of other people have learned a great deal here as well. So thank you once again. And if there are other questions, please ask them if it's okay to stick around. And
yeah, for sure. You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Pierre. As Scott said, you made it seem a lot simpler than for folks, and I think we were all thinking it might be.